you ever get the feeling television isn't what it used to be?
So no. Brexit means Brexit.
We had to take a compulsory course called Combat Propaganda.
Boris Johnson once declared that his life's ambition was to be king of the world.
Does Yevgeny Lebedev have any connection with the Russian spy machine? Well, yes.
Find deeply offensive. Where is the evidence?
I don't care if they find it offensive.
The fundamental problem with Facebook is that it is accountable to no one.
The government was advised to invest money in the NHS. The government aren't listening to the evidence.
The kind of world I want to bring my child into.
And it's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu, and we'll be bringing you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. Tonight I'll be talking to Jolyon Maugham, founder of the Good Law Project, about the many means and ways and indeed trials by which he's held the government to account.
And I'll be speaking to our very own Byline TV producer, Caolan Robertson, about what he's doing to combat far-right radicalisation.
And of course, we're not funded like GB News by hedge funds or big advertising budgets. We are funded by you if you kindly support us on Patreon, which you can see below if you go to patreon.com/Byline TV, patreon.com/Byline TV. There you can sign up and join us in our After Dark section. After the show finishes, we go exclusively only to Patreon subscribers and talk about all the kinds of things we can't talk about now. But Hardeep, it's not been a very busy, it's been quite a quiet week, hasn't it?
Yes, a couple of quiet weeks for us. We were saying on the newspaper, weren't we? A few big things dominating though. I mean, Meghan and Harry and the royals and that saga keeps continuing. We've had more about the coronavirus roadmap, and the schools are opening very soon since we were last on air. And of course, we've had developments around Matt Hancock, that Health and Social Care Secretary, which I think you'll be exploring just coming up. I'll
be doing that very shortly with Jolyon. We'll be talking also about our front page, where we do say the things other papers don't say. For example, what's really happened with the Grenfell money. But before we do that, let me turn to Jolyon Maugham, our guest tonight. I first met Jolyon about 3 years ago when he was involved in challenging various elements of the Brexit legislation. But to find out more about what he's been up to recently, here's a short clip from the Good Law Project.
None of us could have imagined what 2020 would bring. Back in March, when the pandemic first hit, we knew that Good Law Project had a role to play in holding government to account. As the footage rolled in of frontline workers battling to save the lives of others, battling without adequate PPE, we launched legal action to force government to hold an urgent public inquiry into its failings. The families of those who died protecting others from this virus deserve justice. Back in June, we caught wind of PPE contracts going to the weirdest counterparties: a pest control company, a confectioner in Northern Ireland, a family hedge fund owned through Mauritius, a jeweller in Florida. We were alarmed. Supporters like you donated in their thousands, enabling us to bring this scandal into the light. We uncovered backdoor VIP channels, enabling those close to power, those with political connections, to win hugely lucrative procurement contracts. We revealed that government has wasted hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds, on PPE and testing that cannot be used. Politicians and newspaper editors lined up to cite our cases as evidence of cronyism, if not corruption, at the heart of this government. Back in the summer, when the government's A-level algorithm was set to destroy the futures of hundreds of thousands of teenagers, we were there. Within hours, we had pulled together a legal team and taken the first formal step in proceedings. Only 4 days later, government threw the towel in. Leading the charge against the pandemic required the best people in the country, but government refused to look beyond its close friends and associates, and the country now bears the scars of those failures. No government should ever discriminate against those born without a silver spoon in their mouth. But government is doing whatever it can to derail us, It's asking for delays, and it's racking up huge costs, we believe deliberately, in an attempt to scare us off. Government also refuses to answer simple, straight questions about its conduct. We're a small team and we're pitted against the limitless resources of the state, but what we do have is people like you, people just as determined as we are to hold the government to account. 2020 was a year none of us expected. It's been astonishingly difficult for many of us, but together I believe we've shown what good law looks like. Who knows what 2021 will bring, but with your support we know that Good Law Project will be here to continue the fight. We are not optimistic, we are not pessimistic, we are determined.
Well, Jolyon, thanks for joining us in our socially distant lockdown studio. And before we get to this sort of procurement story and the various causes, can we just wind back a little bit? I think I first met you about 2 or 3 years ago during the contestation of the EU referendum. And just one thing first, thank you for appearing on Byline TV, but until recently I didn't see you much on television. Is that an unfair thing to say?
Well, I think Byline Times sits in a space that most of our media neglects, which is the space of those who, as it was put, kick against the pricks. And, you know, I'm a New Zealander, and that's what we're brought up on. It's very much about challenging established mores and not really accepting what our elders and betters tell us. And I very much come from that place, and that's not a comfortable place for our media.
And you're very well dressed tonight, and I like the socks particularly. But that's because I believe after all these years being neglected, I would say, as an outside observer, by the BBC, you've just been recently filming with them or doing some other filming. Is that right?
Well, the procurement stuff that we've been doing lately is quite difficult to ignore. I mean, you mentioned a minute ago that I cut my teeth really doing Brexit litigation. I think the last time we met, I had just come back from Luxembourg, where we'd just argued the Whiteman case that established that Article 50 could be revoked if Parliament wanted. And I then went on to do the prorogation case up in Scotland and then in the Supreme Court, which, as your viewers will remember, succeeded.
Just to explain to the viewers, just in case that was that there was due to be a decision on a vote whether how to leave the EU after Johnson took power, and prorogation meant that we could just fall over into a no-deal situation. Is that right? He basically suspended Parliament, having talked to, apparently, Crispin Odey, a hedge fund owner, about this, that he could suspend Parliament during this crucial vote. And what was just to refresh the audience's memories, the basis of the law that it was that the executive could not suspend Parliament, the legislature?
Well, I mean, we don't know much about our constitution beyond that everyone should play cricket according to gentlemen's rules. I think, you know, the events of the last few years have revealed that our constitution isn't much beyond that. But such that we do understand about it is that sovereignty, supreme power, as it were, rests with Parliament, not with the executive. And, you know, that must be right once you recognise of Boris Johnson that in 2019, at any rate, he had been chosen as Theresa May's successor by a tiny number of people, by those, indeed just a majority of those who are members of the Conservative Party. So once you recognise that fact, you can see that Parliament elected from 34 million, or however big our electorate is, has much greater legitimacy than a Prime Minister elected from a much smaller constituency. And the notion that a Prime Minister, finding Parliament to be an inconvenience to his plans, should be able to suspend Parliament, felt profoundly shocking to me. And so in about June or July of 2019, anticipating that this might happen.
It had been mooted, hadn't it? There was rumours to that effect that he
That's
might
right.
consider that.
There was a lot of chatter that it might happen,
And this is to breed a stalled parliament which couldn't seem to decide on a deal. They couldn't get a majority around a deal. Theresa May kept on failing. In fact, Boris Johnson kept on failing to get a majority around a deal in that parliament. Isn't that right?
There was no majority for anything. There was no majority for a referendum. There was no majority for Theresa May's deal. There was no majority for no deal. Bizarrely, I think the only thing that never got voted on was whether we should just revoke Article 50. But I dare say if that proposition had been put to Parliament, it too would have been rejected. So Parliament was hung, as it were. It couldn't decide on anything. But the consequence of that, so far as our constitution was concerned, is not to hand absolute power to make a decision that Parliament could not to the Prime Minister.
And the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that it was unlawful for the executive to try to prorogue Parliament.
The Supreme Court upheld, at its heart, the Supreme Court said Parliament, not the executive, is sovereign.
So does that hold now? We don't have a written constitution, but effectively we have precedent. Does that mean, thanks to your actions and others, we have actually established that separation of powers to a certain extent?
Well, it does mean that a Prime Minister can't suspend Parliament just because Parliament has become inconvenient to him or her. But in fact, the sort of distinction between the executive, the Prime Minister in other words, and Parliament is starting to collapse really, because what's happened during the course of the pandemic is that MPs have given their votes to the chief whips to cast as their proxies. And effectively that means that Parliament as a separate entity from the executive doesn't really exist anymore.
Because the whips are representatives of the party, and it's the party in power, it's the executive.
That's right, the whips do what the Prime Minister tells them to do, or they're no longer the whips. So if Parliament hands over its power to the whips, then in effect that power falls into the lap of the Prime Minister. And so you're left with one of the important checks on executive power disappearing, albeit not through prorogation, which we successfully overturned, but through this rather more underhand mechanism. I mean, history tells us, doesn't it, that national crises are a great excuse for executive power.
Never miss the opportunity of a good crisis.
That's absolutely so.
And even before then, we were obviously facing a massive change in legislation thanks to exiting the EU and the regulations and powers that came with that. I mean, a lot of this has been scrutinised by Henry VIII powers, haven't they? That some of these laws and statutes which we passed through EU membership are now being taken over by the executive power, rewriting them or using statutory instruments to change them. I mean, it's very technical for our viewers, but it's a fascinating bit where proving what you say, that we think we have a secure constitution, but actually built on norms of good behaviour and not much underpinning it in terms of law.
It is pretty extraordinary and perhaps more profoundly important even than this collapsing of the distinction between Parliament and the Prime Minister, this massive expansion in so-called Henry VIII powers. Henry VIII powers are basically, it's a lawyer's phrase, which means in effect that the Prime Minister or his or her ministers can themselves exercise powers that previously resided in Parliament, and they don't need parliamentary approval for the exercise of those powers. And
so did the Civil War ever happen? This is Crown, was a Crown prerogative or whatever it's called, that basically they still have the powers of a monarch. That's why they're called Henry VIII powers.
They're called Henry VIII powers because fundamentally the Prime Minister in our conception of the Constitution, although I think no longer in political reality, exercises their power as the Queen's personification, if you like, in Parliament.
It's not very encouraging for modern democracy. So just to wind back just a little bit to another piece of legislation, which I know you were quite important on, and that was unpicking what actually went on with the EU referendum. And I know this caused you some trouble. I mean, people targeted you over this issue. Was you managed to get the Electoral Commission to look again at the issue of spending during the EU referendum in 2016.
That's right. We were troubled by the Electoral Commission's indifference to what looked like spending in concert to us. In other words, what electoral law says is that in the hands of any one protagonist must rest only a limited amount of spending power. Of course, a natural way to respond to that, if you've got lots of money and want to spend it all, is to have lots of people who appear to be different but are actually acting in concert, acting together. And one of those people was a common plan spending, acting in concert. One of those people was Darren Grimes, this young fashion student, as he then was, from Brighton, who had this vast sum of money to spend from God knows where, and working hand in glove with Vote Leave.
675,000, I think at least, there were other groups, DUP, involved. And I think there's a group called Believe, which Tom Harwood, another name people might know, is now works for Guido Fawkes, going over to GB News, who's also part of that organisation. And thanks to you, I think, that was opened up. I know Carol Cadwallader found out more because a whistleblower, Shamir Sani, who worked on Believe, told more. But the net effect of this, and in always the prorogation decision, has not been penitence or some kind of moderation or arbitration, both from that referendum and the prorogation, until the election of 2019, I suppose, where, you know, Johnson won a big majority, has been doubling down. Have you sensed that, in a way, every time the law has been used to challenge the powers, if you like, the Brexit establishment, let's call it that, they've just doubled down and come back stronger?
Well, we're living, I think, in a country where the discussion isn't about whether there is decline. The discussion is about the rate of decline, and the debate really is about the impact of the number of significant legal successes that Good Law Project has brought about on that pace of decline in the quality of national life. And who's to know? I'm not to know.
If you slowed it down or speed it up, yes.
I don't think we've speeded it up, but it really is difficult to say. I mean, for me, the notion that a Prime Minister could set aside Parliament, the one mechanic through which we as voters get to seek to impose our will on an overweeningly powerful executive, the notion that the Prime Minister could set that aside as inconvenient to him was profoundly constitutionally offensive, and offensive to me as a Democrat as well.
We actually had writing for Byline Times, a Trident submarine commander who wondered if actually this wasn't a form of a soft coup. But just the comparison with America, where there was on the 6th of January an actual attempted insurrection. There we sort of have observed that the guardrails of the law, the electoral officials, even the Republicans certifying the vote, held. So is your feeling about the British state, the guardrails are very loose anyway, so you don't know if they've held or not?
Well, there are no guardrails here. I mean, as I saw it during the Trump years, the United Kingdom is far worse off than America. Things were not as bad, are not as bad here as they were there. But in America, you could see a way back, whereas in the United Kingdom, it feels like a ratchet. So we don't have meaningfully two houses of Parliament. We don't have meaningfully the check on federal power, state power, and vice versa. We don't have successive intakes into those two houses, and perhaps most importantly of all, we don't have the check on the convenience on the day of the president of norms, constitutional norms built up over time and represented in the form of a written constitution that binds the government of the day. In the United Kingdom, we have none of that. And so every step down feels to me like a ratchet. I do not see any way back. And so then and now I am profoundly depressed about.
Depressed but not defeated. I mean, it's only recently that you've left your law practice, your QC, but now the Good Law Project is a full-time thing for you. Is that right? This has now become your entire work. You're hiring more people. You're sort of pursuing. You even have some journalism on the side. This has become your life's work now. Is that right?
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, I'm just quite stubborn, really. It doesn't. You can't know, can you, whether your efforts will bear fruit or not. Even with the benefit of hindsight, as we were discussing a minute ago, I can't know what effect, if any, my efforts have had looking backwards. What I can know, and what gives me satisfaction, is that I've tried.
And you probably helped stop No Deal, which was seriously in the offing if Parliament had been prorogued around that last October 31st.
Well, another one of the legal actions we took was to force the Prime Minister to send the letter that Parliament mandated he would send, in the face of him saying he would rather die in a ditch than send it.
Yeah. So in a way we can say we did, whatever reason you contribute that, avoid No Deal. To go back now to the sort of procurement stories, which you saw a bit in that film. I mean, I think you probably, even before us, but around about the same time, April last year, started noticing these contracts being published. And how many have you taken to court? I know the key one, just for the audience who don't know, is he won a case against Matt Hancock, the hiring of Public First, which is friends of Dominic Cummings, the founder of a PR company, also used to run a think tank with Dominic Cummings. That was deemed, have I got this right, unlawful?
We hope to win that case. We've won another case. We're still waiting for the outcome of the Public First case. There are so many, it's difficult myself to keep track of them. So we won a case that proved that Matt Hancock had behaved unlawfully in refusing to permit the transparency over public contracting that the law required.
I'm sorry, yes.
We're waiting to hear the outcome of a case challenging the decision of Dominic Cummings to award a lucrative contract to those he described as his friends at Public First.
Right.
And then in May we have a challenge to £350 million worth of contracts to Pest Fix, £250 million of contracts to Ianda, and £108 million of contracts to an Irish wholesale confectioner called Clandeboy.
So this is, just those challenges alone, I think there's about 16 billion that's been tracked, but that's almost a billion there, at least we're talking about 800 million. Vast amounts of public money. I think most of it would be easy to give a pay rise to all the nurses, would be cheaper, of about, I think, 5% than the money that has been spent on a fraction of the PPE. And what do you think happened there? It's thanks to your disclosures, or is it the NAO that we know there was a VIP track?
Well,
so there's, there was a fast track for people who had contacts with public officials, party members, I think, or MPs, and civil servants.
We leaked documents in October showing the existence of a VIP lane. We could not get any mainstream media pickup of that story, which I thought was absolutely remarkable, both the story and the fact that we couldn't get any real mainstream media pickup of it. We published that material, and the National Audit Office in November confirmed the existence of the VIP lane, and all of a sudden our work was taken seriously. And the VIP lane is quite an extraordinary thing, because what we can see is that you were well over 10 times more likely to win a contract if you were introduced to the VIP lane. Well over half of people introduced to the VIP lane were introduced by ministers. We don't know who was introduced to the VIP lane. We don't know which ministers introduced them. What we can see is that those who went through the VIP lane have delivered duff product and been paid higher prices than was paid to those who went through the normal channels, and have made fortunes of tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds from doing so.
And often with companies which had no previous experience in medical or procurement.
Well, the most remarkable thing about it all, I mean, I say that about so many different things, so I find it all completely remarkable. But But perhaps the most remarkable thing of it all is that we had some really high quality PPE suppliers in the UK, and substantially none of them won contracts, and instead these contracts went to confectionery wholesalers,
fashion designers
in Florida, pest control companies in the UK, hedge funds, dormant companies, bankrupt companies,
and friends of ministers,
and overwhelmingly those associated with the Conservative Party. And virtually every day still there is another contract published.
We had another one
with
today.
Links to, and there was another one today.
Yeah, and donors. I mean, just to be fair, the NAO said there was no evidence of any, I don't know how to put this, cronyism, because they hadn't seen any evidence, because they hadn't preserved the evidence of why people got into the fast track, and they couldn't measure any conflict of interest. So that's the problematic thing, is without absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as they famously say. Can I just add another thought, that as we've covered, we think about 600 medical and health workers in the UK died in that first wave of the coronavirus, and many didn't have sufficient PPE, and still it's care homes getting difficult. So this was not just a cost on the public purse, but on our health system.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very difficult to construct counterfactuals to answer questions about how life in the country would have been different during the first wave of the pandemic had we followed the advice developed in planning scenarios before the pandemic, showing that there was an insufficiency of PPE. We can't know what fraction of the £12.5 billion of public money went on PPE rightly. In other words, I mean, the best available data suggests that perhaps maybe as little as £1 billion would have served our needs adequately, rather than the £12.5 billion we've spent.
And just to stop you there, we were part, but we said we didn't get the email of a joint EU procurement, because we had been in a transitional period at that point, weren't we? So we could have worked with the EU to procure at lower cost a lot of this equipment.
Well, I mean, what we do know is that we spent £12.5 billion, and we spent it buying, the NAO says, 5 years of supply, and spending that money buying those 5 years of supply at prices that were 500% of the prices being paid in the fourth quarter of 2019. So if we'd bought 1 year's supply, the number goes down to £2.5 billion rather than £12.5 billion. And if we'd pre-planned, and there was work done before the pandemic to suggest we should have pre-planned, and it looks as though we ignored that work, then the cost would have been much, much lower, perhaps, you know, on those numbers as little as £500 million.
Now we know also some of that procurement is sitting in containers, has not been accessed yet. How many projects or legal challenges do you know you've got going on at the moment?
We have a challenge to the government's failure to hold a public inquiry. We have a challenge to Abingdon. We have 6 challenges to Pestfix, 1 to Clandeboy, 1 to Ianda. We have just jettisoned a challenge to Moonshot. We have a challenge to the government's decision to award a contract to Public First. We have a challenge to the government's decision to award a contract to Hanbury. We have written today to the government telling it that we plan to challenge this monstrous pork barrel exercise,
which we've covered extensively on Byline Times, the Towns Fund and the Levelling Up Fund, which seems strange you go to Tory marginalism more than deprived Labour.
That's absolutely so. And that suite of litigation, I've probably forgotten some of it, is in just one of 3 strands of work that Good Law Project has. So we also do work to protect left behind communities, and we also do environmental litigation as well.
Well, I'm sure our viewers, if they want to go to your site, goodlawproject.org, and support it, I'm sure they'll make their own minds up. We won't push them, though I personally would. Well, we'd like you to come back, if possible, at some point, Jolyon, and tell us how these things are developing. And one of the guardrails is the media. And if they won't cover it, we build it ourselves?
They're getting better. Social media is getting crosser, and they are having to respond. Journalists too are driven by the social media agenda, and everyone is quite irritated that these important stories are being ignored, and that is having an impact.
Well, great work that you're doing. I think, it's neither left or right, is it? How they spend taxpayers' money should concern anybody from whichever political persuasion.
Once upon a time, it was a major concern of the Taxpayers Alliance, Peter, as you'll remember.
Oh yes, Matthew Elliott, who was one of the coordinators of Vote Leave. Hopefully he'll come back. Maybe he'll come to the studio and show his care about Adam Smith values of public taxpayer money. So thank you for joining us, Jolyon, and I hope to see you again. In a moment, we'll be talking to our own producer, Caolan Robertson. Hardeep will be interviewing Caolan about his work in helping de-radicalise people who have been radicalised by social media, and his revelations this week of some off-the-cuff comments of Alex Jones about Donald Trump. So we'll be back in a moment after this clip.
Growing dependence on social media has a dark side.
Members of the so-called alt-right and
Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Did you just call me a woman? I'm legally a man.
Make America great again.
But why is the mother lode of bad ideas?
In Orlando, a massacre at a gay nightclub.
A growing number of members of the right wing are itching for a civil war.
Milo, you're not
How does a liberal young man become a follower of the alt-right?
Gavin McInnes, I think, is fucking hilarious.
I think the West is the best.
Smollett hoax is one of many. They're persuasive YouTube videos.
Forget about the disrespect. Facts don't care about your feelings.
Protect our LGBTQ citizens from the hateful foreign ideology.
Dropped out of college, you were looking for direction.
People need to understand that it's not the kid in Wyoming with gas station beer who becomes this. It is your mailman. It is your servant. It is everyone.
It's the truth, and I'm just going to say it, that I wish I never would have fucking met Trump. I wish it never would have happened. And it's not that the attacks that I've been through. I'm so sick of fucking Donald Trump, man. God, I'm fucking sick of him. And I'm not doing this because it's like I'm kissing his fucking ass, It's just like I'm sick of it.
So Caolan, good to have you join us on this side of the camera. So when Peter and I met you about 2 years ago, you had been working with some far-right figures. And one of those was Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, who's best known to people as Tommy Robinson, a far-right activist who is the co-founder of the English Defence League. So what exactly were you doing in that world?
In 2016, the Orlando shooting happened. 50 gay people were killed in a nightclub by an Islamist terrorist. I wasn't politically active at that point at all. I had a great job. I was working in PR for groups like the Gordon Ramsay Group and things like that. Like, I had a normal life, but I wasn't politically active. I'm not of the boomers age, so I didn't get my news from TV and from traditional media. I got it all from YouTube. So I typed in some of the big issues that were going on at the time, like the Orlando shooting and Brexit. The top rated results were Rebel Media, were Milo's account, Milo Yiannopoulos, were far-right accounts. But I didn't know anything about them. I didn't really know even the difference between Tory and Labour or anything like that. But I found what they said super compelling. They were talking about how LGBT is at war with Islam, how women's rights are also going to be eroded because we're importing hordes of people that are going to be, you know, reversing democracy and all of this stuff. And I felt like there was a war that was going to be coming. Like I came out when I was like 12 years old, and I felt like it was a serious thing. You had at the same time Channel 4 had the Jihadi Next Door come out, where they had Muslims saying that they were going to throw gay people off buildings like in the middle of the street. And I just felt like something really bad was happening. And so I joined that world. I was hired by Rebel Media to be an on-camera correspondent.
And how old were you then?
I was 21,
yeah.
Around the age of 21 back then. So I was pretty young. But my whole thing wasn't like, I didn't subscribe to all the other like talking points of like the far right people who existed at the time. It was just like the LGBT, you know, the idea that gay people are at war with Islam, and I genuinely felt like that was the most important thing, and also that free speech was being eroded. But when I joined that movement, like all of my friends cut me off, my family cut me off, I became totally engrossed in an echo chamber. I also, because I had watched a couple of videos after that Orlando shooting that were commenting on it, you know, Milo and Gavin McGuinness were at the scene of that crime when it came out, and they had the biggest video on it. Just because I'd watched those 2 or 3 videos, for the next few months, even since the next day, there was a endless recommendations list to subscribe and to watch other far-right figures.
And
I was also sent emails by YouTube.
Because of this algorithm that YouTube has, that the more outrageous and extreme the content, the more people watch it, and then because people watch it, that's what's recommended, and it's just a vicious circle.
Yeah, and
isn't it,
YouTube
in that
make a
way?
lot of money from it. And
Yeah.
I was sort of thinking, it's kind of weird, like looking back on it now, I was never looking for that content. A lot of people think, well, you're racist, you're far right, so you go out and you go on the internet and you type in, I don't like black people, and then you get those videos. You type in normal subjects, those videos come up, you watch one of them, and then you're inundated with recommendations by that. So people don't look for this stuff, they're bombarded with it, and that's why it's so toxic and dangerous. I ran some of the biggest, most high-profile YouTube accounts of Lauren Southern, of Tommy Robinson and people like that at the time, when I was right in the middle of it and when I was fully radicalized. And I can say that 80%, at least 80% of all of our views, of which we had nearly 500 million on YouTube, came from YouTube recommendations to non-subscribers, people that were not actively searching and looking for that content, and people that weren't interested in that content. It was pushed to those people in the trending tabs and in the home pages, and also emailed to them. So this was something that was bombarding people completely. And obviously I'm partially, you know, responsible as well in this. I was a cog in this machine. I was also creating this content. It's not just the algorithms.
And which was, I mean, we Peter and I did an article for Byline Times around your work for Tommy Robinson. So for example, give us an example of some of the video content that you were making. I mean, I understand that you were doing a lot of the messaging, thinking of where to go, what to film. So just to give viewers an idea, sort of what kinds of things were you looking
Well, it was
at?
the second wave of Tommy Robinson. The first wave was the EDL. That collapsed. He went to prison and then no one knew who he was. The wave that I was involved in is basically, if you have seen a video by Tommy Robinson in the last, you know, in that period, it will have been something that I made. It was everything. It was the stuff that he did for Rebel. It was the rallies that he organised outside Downing Street, Day for Freedom, things like that. I was at the heart of that entire thing and actually grew him completely. You know, I gave him
And he was
production
turning
value.
up at people's homes and their workplaces and confronting journalists and all that sort of thing.
It's a bit of a cult. I mean, these people are on a crusade as well. Tommy convinced me that that gay people were under attack, and he's got loads of gay friends, and he's worried about them because of Islamists and because of this sort of stuff. It wasn't until the end of starting to work with him I realised that actually he doesn't really care about gay people. I remember him saying comments that were actually super homophobic to me in the car and things like that, and also to his friends behind my back. So I realised that it was all just an act to kind of pull me in. But it was the same thing with everybody else that I worked with. And I thought, like, a lot of people look at this and they're like, well, how could you join something that's clearly so toxic? And I'm like, it presents as diverse. It presents as Candace Owens, a black woman talking about Black Lives Matter. It presents as gay people. And it's a hugely, you know, it looks soft and it's got production value. So it pulls people in quite easily. And once you're in, you're basically hooked. And that's why I'm basically, like in the last couple of weeks, I sort of walked away from all this stuff a couple of years ago, right? I decided that I don't want anything to do with this.
So let's just on that front.
Yeah.
What made you decide to step away from it? And
it was a long process of radicalization. You know, it took 6 months to get me into it, but it was the same thing to leave as well. It was moments. It was traveling to Turkey and doing a documentary about human trafficking and people arriving in Europe, who we had demonized for years, and we had said that they are like awful, you know, people who want to invade the West, who are violent and etc. The people that we saw that showed up on those beaches waiting for those boats were the opposite of what I expected. They were genuine refugees. I know this might seem obvious to a lot of people listening to this now, but it was not obvious to people with a different kind of newsfeed. They were people who had horrific stories, people who were genuinely fleeing war, people who had all of their possessions in black bin bags, walking down the side of mountains and hills and taking some of, like, I remember an old lady even took a fall, and it was just horrific, and I felt really guilty about it, and I started stepping away at that point. I said I'm not going to work with people like Tommy anymore or Lauren anymore. I started to work with Alex Jones a little bit because I just thought, well, he's, you know, a bit of a conspiracy theorist, but he doesn't directly push the far right stuff. But it wasn't enough because Christchurch happened and 50 people were shot in a mosque, and the manifesto of the shooter called it, the shooter's manifesto was called The Great Replacement, which is a video that Lauren had made of the same title, and I read the whole manifesto, and the rhetoric was too similar to stuff that I was involved in.
And how did that make you feel?
It was horrific. I felt extremely guilty. I felt like I had contributed to something that was the same thing that radicalized me in the first place. The same number of people died at the Orlando shooting, and I felt like I had gone full circle on this journey to try and, you know, save the world, to protect gay people, and it's ended up back at the same place, the same kind of violence and the same kind of extremism, which was horrific. I just disappeared from society. Like I disengaged. I said I don't want to do anything in politics anymore. I don't want to do anything. I went and worked in, you know, in a pub in the countryside for a year, and it
what was the general reaction? It's something we've talked about before in terms of people leaving these sort of networks. How would you characterize the reaction to you stepping away?
People were
from that
incredibly
world?
wary of me. People were saying that I shouldn't be forgiven, and I actually don't blame those people at all. Like I genuinely had done at that time like an incredible amount of damage to society, and I don't think that people that do those sort of things should be able to that participate in that should be able to just freely walk away. I feel like they need to undo that. It's different if you're talking about people like Caleb Kane from the New York Times, who, you know, was a viewer of our content. If someone who is radicalized but they're not actively participating in it, that's a different story. But someone who is participating like me, I feel like that they need to undo to an extent what they helped build.
Yeah.
So I understand that, and I understand that skepticism. That's totally reasonable.
I mean, Peter and I have had obviously queries to Byline Times, and when we announced that you were one of the producers of Byline TV, people have obviously said to us, well, you know, how do you square that with the mission? And, you know, we very much believe that people should take responsibility for what they have done and own the consequences of that. But surely they can use that in order to, you know, to progress something going forward. I mean, people call it sort of, I've seen what's been said about, you know, you're trying to whitewash what was happening, you're trying to rehabilitate yourself and your image, but it's not really true. I mean, again, what do you say to people saying those things? And I mean, has that had some effect in the work we're going to come on to now, which you're doing to try to help other people come out of these networks?
Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't been public. I don't want to make money from my image, and I don't really like going on camera and talking about this stuff because I don't want to benefit from in any way from, you know, talking about these things. But I think that the work speaks for itself. Byline TV, Byline Times specifically is amazing at disinformation and dismantling people that were lied to. One of the biggest videos that I made a few weeks ago was about, you know, people that voted Leave that were lied to. That's kind of you, and I feel like in a way that I'm using the skills and all of the sort of stuff that I used to do for bad, and I'm genuinely using it to contribute to something that is actively dismantling those structures and it's actually dismantling those people specifically as well.
Yeah.
And that stuff is still huge. Like today I was filming an interview outside Downing Street, and a couple of Tommy sort of right-wing supporters came up to me and they were like, "Oh, Caolan, like, keep up the good work." And I was like, that happened on camera. I think it's coming out next week, but I was like, this is still a huge thing that's still growing and really needs to be, like, this is why I'm actively engaged in politics again now and not just hiding away in the countryside, because I feel like I really have a role to actively use the skills that I have to help build that stuff up, to help take it down, and to also, you know, work with progressives and work with people that actually care about building a better world that doesn't harm or lead to real world violence.
Do you feel that some people who, you know, may describe themselves as progressive or obviously wanting to build a better world and eradicate sort of social and racial injustices, I mean, if their reaction to someone like you is that perhaps they can't look past what you did, and for them that might be a defining characteristic of you now, regardless of what you go on to do. Do you feel, how helpful is that in terms of if we want to make progress and de-radicalize people and stop them going into these networks and stop atrocities happening, how helpful do you think having that view is? I mean, how problematic is it, I guess?
It is problematic, but there's a huge number of people that will never accept me and forgive me. But I'm not really interested in that, because I'm not doing any of this stuff to have acceptance and to have friends and to be forgiven and to get into new circles and things like that. I'm doing it because I saw the Capitol storming and I recognized half the faces there, and I felt like I needed to do something, and I felt like maybe some of those people wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for me, or people who were part of that machine. And so I'm literally just doing it because I feel like if I can dismantle it, I started Future Freedom, which is a group that pulls people out of the far right. I did that in response to the Capitol storming with people who were also involved in this industry to walk away.
So that's where people who are trying to leave these networks can contact your organization and talk to you and others who have been through the same process. Is
well,
that
there's
right?
no group that exists right now that has been set up post 2016 that directly deals with people that were radicalized by YouTube algorithms, by this sort of civic nationalist like posting stuff. It doesn't exist. They're all sort of from the 90s and they're about traditional neo-Nazis. So I realize there's an extremely valuable space that needs to be filled. Where young people who were in the same position I was when I was 21 and I was typing in Orlando into YouTube feel like they went down a dark journey, but they can walk away and they can have a normal life afterwards. I managed to do that to an extent. Samantha, who co-founded Future Freedom as well, has done that to an extent. And I feel like that is, it's been incredibly effective. We've had hundreds of people inquire and hundreds of people who are involved in the Proud Boys and far-right movements in America who have said, I've wanted to leave for years, and I've never seen anyone else do it, and I just didn't feel like I was empowered to be able to do that.
And the ethos of this group is less about judgment, you were saying, and more about actually just talking to people and listening and relaying your own experiences. Why is that? Why do you think that's a better approach than sort of perhaps another method of doing it, which involves sort of more moralistic sort of narratives?
Like, my interest is just getting people out of the far right. That's it. It's not to convert people to the left or to convert people to communism or anything like that. Like a lot of groups do exist and do that. It's to decrease the size of the far right. So for me, my main objective is to, like, one of the main reasons that people don't leave the far right and leave those groups, and I know that a lot of those people, is because they're terrified that society will reject them, that they'll be judged, and they're terrified of how it's going to be. And that's keeping them in it, and that's keeping the size of the far right in existence, and it's keeping it all growing. So I want to provide a space where we can say, look, you can walk away, you can, you can dismantle a little bit of it, or you can live a normal life afterwards. And people like us have done it, and it's providing resources of other people that have left and stories to empower and sort of get others involved in it to walk away. And that's it. And it's about not judging people. A lot of groups say, well, you have to be left-wing now because you did this, and then you have to be on the other side. We don't care about where you go afterwards once you're not contributing to damaging society and to growing the far right. We just want you out of it. And we're just a gateway to that. And it's working. It's incredibly successful.
I mean, to me, that seems like a very important structural point, that if your goal is to stop people doing this, then sort of certain moralistic beliefs and moralistic judgments, and it's not necessarily about anyone accepting you. They can accept you or not. But if I guess it's more what you're trying to do to stop people going down that path, regardless of what people think of you, is perhaps what you're trying to get at.
Yeah. And it's a huge industry, and it's still growing, and it's really scary. Just because YouTube have deleted a few people, everyone thinks that these problems are fixed. This morning, as an experiment, I created a brand new YouTube channel, and I watched one Tucker Carlson video. I was immediately recommended Jordan Peterson and a Lauren Southern video. So it's still happening on the same scale it was before. Alex Jones has just, in the last half an hour, released a whole video about me, saying that I'm, a traitor, because I left a cult, right? I mean, these people are saying being a traitor is worse than being left-wing. That's just received 130,000 views. So the audience is still there and the growth is still there. And I think it's important also with the work we're doing with Future Freedom to highlight the scale of that and to stop people forgetting that it's still there and how important it is.
And let's talk about, so obviously this clip that you provided to Hate Watch about, filmed with Alex Jones. What made you do that? I mean...
Again, the Capitol storming, I felt like it wasn't enough just to leave and actually just to work for an amazingly progressive outlet and providing my skills to dismantle what I used to do before. I actually have to expose a lot of these people, to be completely honest. I've got footage of Alex Jones saying things that are... a lot of Alex Jones supporters would have gone to the Capitol riots and would have gone to these kind of terrible anti-democratic things that have happened. If they would have seen the clip that I've just posted last week, which is of Alex saying that he doesn't actually care about, Trump, and he's basically like a grifter, right? They might not have gone, and they might not see those people as the messiah that they do. So I think it's extremely valuable and extremely important that those people see that stuff directly. Because if the left-wing media, which is how they see the media, like this big scary left-wing thing, says that Alex Jones is a grifter, they're going to say, well, they're just saying that because they're left-wing. If I can actually provide complete evidence and say, well, this is him saying it himself, I think it will be extremely effective and more than any kind of story that's been done about him. So I feel like it's valuable, and I'm just going to continue to do that.
Yeah. And in terms of future freedom, I mean, how big do you want it to grow, and do you think it could really start to change that narrative that we've been talking about, that it's not about acceptance or judgment or moral issues, it's just how do we stop people doing this should be perhaps the biggest priority of all. I mean, you hope that what you're doing can contribute to changing that. What might that involve beyond future freedom? I mean,
it's a hard question because I didn't start it thinking that it would blow up like it did. I thought that a few people would see it and that it could provide resources to people to just question what they're doing and maybe think, you know what, maybe now's the time to leave. But it has been 1,000 times bigger than what I thought it would be, just in terms of the number of people that are contacting us and the number of people that feel like that are resonating with it and say that finally for the first time I've read something that I feel like you get it. And I want it to completely encompass that space where if people, I think over the next few years as well, there's going to be a lot of people who were part of the system that I was involved in and who were viewers of this kind of content, who feel like it's time to leave and who feel like it's all gotten a bit too far, or maybe who saw real world events like I did a few years ago and walked away. And I feel like I want to become the #1 space where they can go to get away from that, because it's not judgmental, it's not harmful, it's not trying to profit off those people, it's not trying to turn them into like celebrities or whatever. It's just to get people out. That's our only goal. So I think it'll be pretty big. It's just been overwhelming. It's been amazing.
And just finally, do you regret it, Caolan, or has it just been part of the journey that's got you to this point where you're now helping other people with their radicalisation?
It hasn't been. It's hard. I think that stuff all the time. I feel incredibly guilty about it. Of course, I regret doing it. If I can take tens and hundreds of thousands of people out of the far right in a couple of years, and if my work can really dismantle and undo what I helped build to a point where it's in a worse state than when I found it, then I won't regret it. But I haven't managed to do that yet because it has grown out of control, and I feel like I've still created a monster. So still to this point, fully wish I never met Tommy, wish I never typed Orlando into YouTube and did that whole process. Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming and talking to us about it. And no doubt, in time we'll be talking more about your work dismantling some of these far-right networks and the people in them. But thank you, Caolan. Right, next up, I'll be joined back with Peter in the studio, and we are going to be looking at our digital front page, which we do on the Byline Times site every week. This week, leading is our story that Sam Bright, our chief politics reporter, put together on Grenfell and funds that were designated to support those who were bereaved and survivors of the fire are still not reaching the people who really need it. That was a really good investigation by Sam, Peter. It was. And
I think our headline was abandoning, ignoring
the
real causes.
Yeah.
We also look at Yemen and Boris Johnson's sort of attitude to a senior diplomat there. I kind of think that's most of our work on Byline Times, is trying to find the real cause of these things, whether it's structural racism, it's inequality, it's cheating by vote leave, it's radicalisation by YouTube and social media, which makes money out of. I found that very interesting and sort of quite intense interview with you, Caolan. I'm glad.
Yeah, and we will. I mean, we've talked about this before. Peter is the editors of Byline Times, together with Stephen Colgrave. I mean, we want to be completely transparent. We will be talking more to Caolan about his work as it goes on, won't we?
Well, they do. I think, somebody said to me, I think it was Caolan actually, the proof of the pudding is in the actions. And we met Caolan and George nearly 2 years ago now, and people were suspicious, but I think their work since vindicates them, judged by the deeds, not just the words of people. And you know, they do fantastic work. But we've also worked with whistleblowers all the time.
Yeah.
And any whistleblower,
Phone hackers,
phone
etc.,
hacking
yeah.
whistleblowers, Cambridge Analytica, vote leave whistleblowers. Anybody who's a whistleblower usually has a bit of something in their past to be a little bit embarrassed by. And I do think, you know, if we believe in not throwing away the key in criminal justice terms, I would believe in the rehabilitation of offenders. I think we should also look for that in everyday life, in political life. I mean, it's not redemption in any religious sense. It's especially young people, you know. We all make mistakes. I certainly made mistakes. I don't think you have, Hardeep, but I certainly have made them. So that's, I think this about wraps it all up for tonight. Everybody, thanks for joining us. 2 long but really interesting interviews. Next week we'll be preparing the print edition, and we're already working on the front page. We'll have that, another very interesting guest, whatever happens. We're trying to get people in studio as much as possible. But that is difficult, but it will get better. And meanwhile, watch out for the other Byline TV content. It's amazing, it's Hardeep. There's films for going to especially the fishing industry, and with Mike Goldsworthy's program. And we have a special new presenter about to be announced, which is very exciting. So do, if you can, help us keep going by subscribing to Patreon, and that's patreon.com/Byline TV. There, if you sign up quickly, you can join us for Byline Times After Dark, Hardeep. And what's that, in 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
So we'll be saying goodnight. It's good night from me.
See you next week.